I thought it might be a good idea just to get each of the panelists to introduce yourself quite briefly in turn, so everyone who turned up just for the drinks and didn't see any of your excellent presentations know who you are.
Hi, I'm Vanessa, so I work for the Department of Defence and I'm the team lead for the technical guys delivering a private cloud using OpenStack.
Hey, I'm Rupert. I'm the CEO of Vault Systems. We build a couple of clouds all based on OpenStack for government. So we have an unclassified and a protected cloud at the moment, and we're building other clouds as well.
Hi, I'm Richard Northam. I work within higher education under the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy and sit on the governing bodies of a number of NCRIS projects, including Nectar, RDS, AAF, and also do a little bit of work for ANS.
Hello everyone, I'm Joanna Huang. I work for Aptera General Managers for the East Asia region. And I'm also a user group lead in Taiwan and also helping the China user group to cooperate. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. The title of this panel is Why Should Government Embrace Open Source Technology? And I thought a really good place to start might be all the way over with Vanessa, who, if you didn't see her presentation, was grilled with questions for about 20 minutes. So we know that she's very, very good at answering them. And I wondered, Vanessa, if you could start off, we've talked a lot today about security, and do you have any thoughts or comments on open source as it applies to security? For example, is it better or worse than vendor offerings? Is it just all bad? What's the deal with security in open source?
So I guess with security, you've got your vendors. Normally they'll give you a black box, so you don't always know what's in there. So if you're going to look after that, it's a bit harder to harden or to look into it and to answer the questions you need. With open source or OpenStack, it's very easy. You can get, if you've got the technical knowledge, you can get the staff to look at it, and you can also modify it. With open source, you can push it back up to the community, and if you haven't done anything crazy, it normally gets accepted. So when you bring it back down, it's part of the stream, it's easy to upgrade, it's just built in. That's why it's a lot easier.
Absolutely. And Rupert, you have a particular interest in security. Would you like to share a bit more about what you're doing and
Yeah, sure.
what you've been hearing around the government?
Well, so essentially what Vanessa just said is exactly right. When we about 5 years ago, when I worked for a previous company, we used to secure VMware and other platforms, and the reality is you just don't know what's going on inside. You're not in control. You add security layers around the outside, which normally adversely affect either availability or performance or security, to be honest, even. So you meet the security requirement by actually lowering the ultimate security of the system, which isn't what we want. So OpenStack's really allowed us to pull it apart and re-engineer the parts of it that we need to conform to government security standards. And as Vanessa said, the stuff we do contribute back to the open source community is good, but then there's also a lot of stuff that we do that would be called crazy stuff for the open source community, because some of the government standards that are needed are just not of any interest to the commercial side of people consuming OpenStack. So there is then a section or a distribution of OpenStack that we then have to maintain.
Richard, I believe you're on a board of a project that's been around for quite a while now that runs a distributed cloud throughout Australia. Do you see any advantages in terms of open source in getting different organizations, different administrative boundaries to collaborate and work together?
Yep, so absolutely. So I think one of the things, if I think about the Nectar Research Cloud, it works across all Australian universities. And so what the OpenStack technology has allowed us to do is actually build a cloud platform that actually transcends organisational boundaries. And if you think about how researchers work, they don't respect organisational boundaries at all. They want to collaborate with the best person in bioinformatics, for example. And so that might be someone in Western Australia. And so OpenStack has allowed us to create this environment where they can work across all those institutional boundaries, they can collaborate with whoever they want to. And if I think about another project that I work on, which is the Australian Access Federation, where we have an identity federation with over 1 million identities in it across higher education, and the entire technology stack for that is built on open source. And that's really closely tied to things like security that was mentioned just then. And this is something that that's been completely successful in the higher education context and has actually proven to be a very secure way of thinking about identity.
Absolutely, thank you. And finally, Joanna, do you have any comments from Taiwan and East Asia in terms of how government is adopting open source? And
Yeah, I can share some like stories from Taiwan and China. I moved back to Taiwan like 2 years ago, and then start noticing the government start using open source project or solutions inside the OpenStack sectors. Not sure how many people know about it. Taiwan's been under this democracy revolution for decades, but in recent years, believe it or not, some of the democracy movements are actually led by online open tech communities. They built the open source solutions, public tools for people to get their participations with the government, and also built the open source, open data platforms to help government to be more open, to be more accessible, and in order to engage with the collaborations, governments actually start making some change in its public sectors. So they adapt these open source solutions and talk to the community people, even hire some key leaders from the open source tech communities to be the cabinet members and making these some policies for the e-gov projects. So it's amazing to see this change. And also in China, China has set its goal to launch its own e-gov projects or cloud. Put most of its public service online by 2020. They actually throwing huge budget on these big projects. So I just gave the numbers in this afternoon. Actually, last year the China government spent around 16 billion Australian dollars on its IT sectors, government department, and ICD estimate in next 2 years the number will reach 22 billion Australian dollars. So that's a lot of money the government is throwing into the market. It not only help the industrial to grow. Actually, I know some of the major cloud providers, innovative provider, they build their solution on top of OpenStack. They actually have more than half a business on e-gov project. That's good to see, because government supported throwing money to the market, help the company to grow, and also help other areas to go through their innovative process. Yeah.
Excellent.
Sorry, I talked too much.
Not at all.
So much to share.
So we've now gone linearly through the panel with a bunch of softball questions just to wake everyone up on the panel. It's now time to turn to the audience, and our esteemed microphone.
Think of me as Jerry Springer.
So does anyone...
If you make eye contact, I'm bringing the mic to you.
Question from the audience for the panel. He will pick you.
No one's making eye contact yet.
We got one.
Oh, there's one.
Yep,
over
we got
there.
a couple. I'll come this one up here. Yep.
Thanks. Quick question. What are your thoughts on the challenges bridging what you've got in place in government, federal government environments currently with legacy architecture and the short to medium term challenges in OpenStack going forward? So how do you get through the roadblocks of what we've got invested in currently versus where we would like to go with the open source cloud?
Who would like to take that one?
We can start with you, Vanessa. You're doing it from the inside. A very challenging question. Thank you, Des. There's obviously quite a lot to that. So, Vault strategy is we're working through a partner ecosystem. We're trying to engage the incumbents that are working with government now, so that the changes to the services that they're receiving aren't necessarily the same as what they're seeing as changes to the underlying infrastructure. There's a whole load of plans that aren't really announced for us around education and training and support services around government, which I'll probably go into in the next conference a little bit more. But in terms of your other question at the end of it, which is where do we want to get to, and this isn't necessarily Volt's vision, but more my personal vision. So the question for this talk is really about open source, whereas I actually think for government there's another question around open standards, both of which are of course mandated for government to use anyway. But so my dream in terms of what I want to see out of government is essentially that agencies and partners all essentially work on an open standards framework. So whether you're using HP, SAP, Oracle, Vault, or whoever, essentially what I'm saying is not AWS and not Azure, because they're obviously proprietary platforms, but people that are working across those open standards platforms, because there's this big desire within government to do shared services, right? And what we see is that one government agency really isn't able to prioritize the needs of another government agency above its own to deliver that shared service. So ultimately, those models quite often fail. Whereas the idea of pouring in your energy into the intellectual property of the frameworks that sit on top of that in the PaaS and the SaaS layer, and then being able to share that in a government community marketplace. And we're just literally talking about sharing configuration files between. That means then whether the next agency is on whichever OpenStack or Open Standards platform, they're then able to deploy those blueprints out and then actually tweak them to that agency's requirements. And so that's really what I'm hoping to see out of the OpenStack movement, and that's why ultimately Volt chose OpenStack as the technology to back, because there was a whole load we could have chosen 5 years ago when we started, but really that vision of government being able to share that intellectual property and not do the same thing again and again. And actually it works the same for the partners. So if you imagine one of our partners goes into government today in some unknown configuration state of infrastructure, they normally spend around about a year deploying out something that they essentially all they do as a business is deploy these same things. So with something like a Vault Cloud or whoever, because we're obviously certified, but anyone that takes OpenStack to a certified level, they're then able to go into a known state, deploy that piece of intellectual property out straight away, and have something up within days rather than in a year. So the cost for them dramatically reduce, which means they can then pass that on to the government and therefore on to the taxpayer. And then also the government is able to then contribute into those things as well. So I think that's really, where we're trying to get to is worth the pain that we're going through, and there are a lot of roadblocks in answer to Des' question to get there, and there's a lot of things we're trying to do, and there's a lot of things our partners are trying to do to overcome this as well. It might be interesting to hear Vanessa's view from the inside.
I guess for me, making things, at the moment we're taking the hard slog. So we're actually doing our own implementation, we're doing our own design, we've got our own code base, but just knowing that when another government department comes to us and wants to see it, then we can give that to them. So maybe they've got a smaller team, and then we can work together and share. If they deploy our code base, they improve it and they give it back to us, that's a win for us. It expands our staff, the people fixing it up and contributing, and also a win, for the government is always a great thing. Just time-saving effort. Hopefully someone else will come along and they'll share their other product with us. If you push it back into the community, they'll improve it and you get the benefit from that. You might have started it, it might have been clunky, but if it comes back and it's improved in some way, it's worth it. It just means that you didn't have to spend time doing that and someone else helped you. As for moving forward, I think the government really needs to start embracing it. This is my opinion as well, all these are my opinions, but otherwise we're going to start falling behind. If you're still doing bare metal, if you're not doing it for a specific reason, it's not your exception, then you're going to still get stuck with cloud. Same with like virtualization, containers, everyone is on about containers now, and are we prepared for it? And then that's something else that we might get left behind. And then the further you get left behind, the more expensive it gets to catch up. And the less people you have because you're old technology.
So if I reflect on what's happening overseas and I think about the US, you have the Government Services Administration, which is building what Rupert was talking about, building those common services for all the federal agencies. And the really interesting thing is that Government Services Administration came to Australia and grabbed the the open source technology stack for the Australian Access Federation and are now deploying that for the US government. Now, if the US federal government, I don't know how many of you have ever dealt with them, but they can be a challenging organisation. You think about the Office of Personnel Management within the US that lost something like 4 million bits of personal data 12 months earlier. They've been able to take that step and put their trust in open source software for identity management, which is absolutely at the core of security. If they can do it, why can't the Australian government do it?
I just want to add, embracing open source solution is not just technique itself. It's actually cultural change. It's actually a lot of change going on in the organizations. But government don't need to cope with that by its own. I've been seeing the really successful cooperation models in China. So they use PPP, public-private partnership, working models. So of course, government, if they introduce new things, new technologies to their sectors, they will figure out for reasons. Yeah. But if they know someone's there, always pick that up and then deliver the solution, or even bring in some innovation or technologies into the organization. I think for both sides, from government perspective, they will be happy to see the mature solutions provided by some vendors. But from the vendor perspective, they will be happy to get these big projects across the entire countries, big massive scales. I think that win-win situations.
It's an interesting point. Have either of you three seen any public-private partnerships in cloud computing happening in Australia? I can't think of any. Maybe we should do some of that. Though the other point Joanna was talking about was also culture and cultural change inside organisations, be they government or not. I was wondering if you'd like to consider continuing that conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So yeah, I mean, it's a massive challenge. I think for us internally, because all of this stuff is native to us, I really didn't appreciate the work we've got ahead of us in terms of that. So not just in government itself, but also within our partners. The education piece within Canberra to upskill people is really, for me, the biggest roadblock I see in this space. And I would imagine, Vanessa, that's pretty much what you'd be experiencing as well. The desire and the energy for people to learn this when everything's kind of running okay as is, we're probably struggling to get that impetus to get people to basically take some time off work, to spend some time learning and being educated. And I think the support structures today in government aren't really there as well from an education point of view. Obviously, you're running some stuff internally, and so that's probably over the next 12 months really what we're trying to get Vault to get behind more, is being able to give that structured learning and resources specifically to government and the way that government can use open standards and open source software to get the best out of it. One of the issues with open source, of course, is these massive meaty government contracts. There's no one really pushing the open source agenda within government. It tends to be, there are some exceptions to that, but quite often it's vendors trying to push in quite large proprietary solutions. And so I think the voice of the open source community compared to the rest of the world and to the rest of the country hasn't really been as heard as much in Canberra, and we're very much hoping to change that.
So I guess we do have the vendors that come in and they do sell you that great ideal, and it's great. I mean, like what they do offer is wonderful. It's like put it in and then you've got it straight away. But you need to really understand what you're taking on when you do that. So even if you are going to go down that path, you still need to investigate, like, well, what product are they using internally? Do we support that? Do we like that? Is this really going to mess with us later on down the track? Open source, it's out there, it's open, so you kind of have the idea of what you're getting. If you do any search on Google and you search for OpenStack, you can find a wealth of information. It's not hidden behind the doors, and you have those user stories and you have that experience. with the culture, it's easier to push that risk off. And that's one thing I think government tends to do. It's just like, well, we've now paid you to do all this. The risk is on you, not on us. And that's a safety barrier that people really have to push through. It's that fear of failure that really does bog us down with our culture and our process. And the risk of failing in public is always a disaster.
Indeed. So, potential disaster incoming. Another question from the audience.
Just a question for Rupert again regarding the vaults.
I didn't plant the questions, I
So the
promise.
accreditation, the accreditation is quite important to host the government data or classified data, and we know that OpenStack releases 2 releases per year. You know? So does that impact how often do you change your the release of your platform, and how does that impact the accreditation you get from the ASD?
It obviously does have an impact. So we're on Liberty at the moment, so we're a bit behind. We're deploying Mataka pretty soon, I understand. Yep, good. So I mean, we essentially try and stay about 6 months behind, much for the same reason that Hewlett-Packard just said around integration and testing and stuff, because we do have to back put in a lot of modules around security that we've done. So we have a whole test and acceptance process around that. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, as a business, when you come down to the essence of what does Vault Systems do, it is putting the energy into ensuring the compatibility between government security requirements and the community rapid-paced development that occurs within OpenStack. So yes, there's a lot of work around that, but ultimately that's the absolute core and essence of what we do. We are a technology company first and foremost, and so that's where our energy goes.
And do you think that will you ever get I think your current classification level is DLM or up to Protect? Will you be able to get to secret or top secret? Can you provide more exposure?
Well, yeah.
to
So
the
essentially, so in terms of the Vault infrastructure, so there's a secure internet gateway that sits out the front, and then behind that, there's several clouds in different regions in Sydney and Canberra. So what we've done there is essentially each of those clouds is built identically. So we actually run today in production an unclassified DLM cloud and a protected cloud. We're in the design phase for higher classifications, and so essentially within that. It's cheaper for us to run those same security controls across all of them. There are no certification processes for S&TS, so we obviously then have to go through with those agencies that are doing that. But we do house our stuff. So we literally co-locate with Defence in Global Switch. We're in a Zone 5 room with TS workloads literally in the rack next to ours. So we're very much designed around trying to, and it's back to that vision again of you build these blueprints and these templates, and if you want to put them in a DLM environment or in a TS environment, you can then deploy them across those environments without needing to change too much. And with one of the difficulties in government is getting security cleared or vetted personnel. So the idea of having an unclassified DLM cloud so people can do test and dev in an unclassified cloud and then can chuck it over the wall into a protected or a secret cloud very much appeals both to us and the agencies, because then they can actually start to do the earlier stages of development with lower lower vetting of staff.
Thank you. Looks like we've got a question in the back of the room.
I'm a security literate architect who's got a number of systems accredited across Defence, usually new ones. I don't see any problem with open source because the more eyeballs looking at it, the better for me, because someone will pick up a problem if there is one there. My problem is when it's a black box and I can't see into it and I have to build a perimeter around it to protect it. So open source is fine and should not stop its accreditation to any of the levels. Wasn't my question though.
I agree with your statement.
Yeah, it was a statement. The question is that the reason I think why Apple, Windows, Google, Amazon and so forth are all well known is that they captured the actual home market and made their name on the fact that it became the thing to have one of their platforms. And most people, if I go out on the street, most people, 99 out of 100, will have heard of cloud and will know what cloud is. None of them will have known and will know OpenStack as a name or whatever it is. When do you think that will change and what will make it change?
Well, yeah. So I mean, what you're talking about is something. So he's trying to make OpenStack sexy, essentially. I personally find the whole project amazing and very ideological, and I like a lot of things about it. And I think, obviously, in this room full of people, when you start to go to the international conferences, and you've now got just thousands of people turning up, there's thousands of people contributing. So there is an amazing amount of energy going into OpenStack, not just in terms of people's spare time, but there's a lot of full-time committed, like IBM and HP and all sorts of other organisations. And ours, where we've got full-time dedicated people working on this stuff. And so it is growing, and it is growing very rapidly. And I think what I've seen from the OpenStack Foundation is the ability to bring people together and direct that. The reality is the OpenStack Foundation just doesn't have the budget of some of the big proprietary players. So I think OpenStack will always fail to have that wow factor in some ways. But for me, under the skin, it absolutely is better than anything else out there. And I think sometimes it just takes time for the better product to come through. And sometimes perhaps the better product doesn't always come through. But in this case, I actually think it's past that critical mass where I think the momentum will continue. I don't know if you...
I just would like to add why the open source or some open source projects is really successful. I think the key is the community behind it. Because if you use it, you are part of the communities. You need to contribute back to the community. That the community knows you are using it. That's important for you. Don't kill it, these projects. That's also back up your Vanessa's ideas. Like when you evaluate the solutions, your vendor come to you, and it's all great ideas, but you need to do something. It's not like you buy the vendor solutions and let them do the work. You don't do anything. No, you need to engage with your communities. And that's where the brand is from, because your technical people, they know it, and they will influence your organization, higher level people. And then they say, they're all talking about open source solutions. I think we need to change the mindset. It's all like a cultural, again, it's a near cultural change. So I think engaging with the community more is the key to keep the product more successful and stronger.
Indeed. So if we're talking about public recognition of the name, slight anecdote for you all. I'm sure you're aware that there are many films and TV shows that get built on top of OpenStack. So there's this particular one, pretty good actually, I'd recommend it if you're into American television, show called Unreal. And at the very end of their first episode, they did a fade out to a black screen, and this is on broadcast television on cable in the US. I can't remember which network, but it said, "Thank you, OpenStack community," there in white letters on the screen, broadcast to millions of people. So there's some people who are really wondering what this OpenStack community thing is in public. But I didn't know, Richard, whether you're about to jump in on something or whether we should go to the question in the front.
So I look at OpenStack and I term it as it's as a service, so it looks after computers as a service, containers as a service. In a government space, that means a lot of teams are relinquishing control to the OpenStack team to run as a service. Do you see, with the customers that you visit or internally, issues with this as a service methodology do you think OpenStack may be going too far across the services, or do you think it could be embraced and it could be the common set of APIs that a workload within an enterprise IT would use?
So I guess control is a big part for us internally. They really do like to have control of it. But when there's a problem, they come to you and ask for help because you've got the skill set. They're just there looking after their own machine. It's working well until there's a problem. What I've found, though, with developers, mainly our customers, they love to give you all the operating system problems, and they love you to harden it. It's that carrot to get them to come on board, telling them that they no longer have to do procurement to buy their hardware, they no longer have to worry about the networking underlie, the installing, the racking and stacking. Their eyes just kind of light up because it saves them a lot of time.
So if I think about my career in IT and what I've observed in higher education, that loss of control is certainly something that I've seen in IT staff, and I remember in an early part of my career trying to prise the fingers off a IT staff member as he's hanging onto his email server, which we all know today is pretty dull and boring to run. I think the thing for me is, as you manage your way through this cultural change and losing control, where I've seen it work very well in higher education is getting IT staff to really focus on the core business. And in higher education, it's teaching and learning and research. And if you think about research, the research that happens in higher education, it's the next best thing. It's solving cancer. It's solving all those things. And when you get IT staff signed up to forgetting about controlling all the bits underneath and actually focusing on the value adds that go on top of that, and they then start to see that they're actually making a real difference to society, that's been part of how I think you have to break down that culture for of that perceived loss of control. Is get them really focusing on the why it matters and what those value adds are on top of the dull and boring stuff.
Absolutely. How are we doing over there, Flanders?
I've caught a couple of eyes waiting to ask questions.
You think anyone just hasn't raised their hand, but actually is
they're being
interested in
shy.
asking a
Oh, here we
question?
go. Here's another one.
We got one.
Hello. I suppose with open source and so forth, there's a lot of community support and things like that. But in terms of the general population and community, how would you see the level of interest in terms of developing code and more specifically code that's suitable for cloud as opposed to the more traditional stuff where people have come from in the past? How do you see that sort of changing or evolving in your communities?
I think I do see some interest from the developer communities since the OpenStack, I'm talking OpenStack particularly, it's been really mature and stable, it's widely used. So a lot of companies, they kind of know, okay, it's going to work. I'm going to migrate or build the future application on top of OpenStack. So more and more people actually come to the communities, ask us to get some trainings about, or ask where they can get the resources to learn or to train their engineers. Because if you can code, it's so easy to learn the tools, but there is different concept like moving your cloud cloud. You need to make it scalable, you need to make it fault tolerant, those kind of things. So this is something our community need to do more to educate and to promote our developer community. That's what we haven't done enough, but I think the interest is growing and the foundation is continuously promoting this.
If I think about the broader problem of developers, we don't have enough of them. In fact, in Australia, we think about IT positions. We don't have enough IT professionals. Enrolments in computer science courses across Australia are at an all-time low. And I think part of the challenge, I think we need to go back to how do we get young kids interested in developing, and not just young men, but young girls. How do we get them interested? And start to build that pipeline of people who are passionate about developing stuff and developing it in open source. And if you look at the Raspberry Pi project out of the UK, I mean, it's all based on open source software. And I don't think we're doing a particularly good job here in Australia of actually building that next generation of developers. And if you think about some of the interesting things you see around the world, there was an experiment done in India where a researcher put a computer in a wall on the edge of a slum. There was no instructions, no nothing. And within a couple of months, the young kids were programming. Within a week, they'd worked out how to use Google. Within a couple of weeks, they were streaming videos. And after a while, they started to teach themselves how to actually program. And interestingly, they thought it must have been someone walking past helping the kids. So they ran the experiment again in a rural village. Same thing happened. So I think there is a lot of young inquiring minds out there who actually are interested in programming, but it's become very geeky and unsexy to be an IT person in Australia. And I don't know what it's like in other parts of the world, but I think that's something that we must address as part of addressing this whole problem.
Yeah, I guess following on from that, it's you're saying with the low enrolment for computer science, yet the enrolment for law is very high, yet the number of law jobs is dropped dramatically. So I find it really perplexing that that's the way it is. And I think in terms of in Australia not being cool, I think whenever I go over to San Francisco and Silicon Valley, like, developers are basically rock stars. Like, it's really admired over there, and I think it will take time, and that will come here as well as there's more investment into that. Yeah, so I was just trying to think back to the original question. Yeah, so in government particularly, I think the thing we see is we've got, so in terms of partners, we see a fair bit of people doing stuff with microservices and scaling and all of that sort of stuff. But when you go into government agencies, they may change the technology out to a cloud, but they actually still have the same process. So quite often, a senior person in government will say, "Hey, if we're gonna do something with cloud, we'll do a greenfields project so it can be cloud native." Of course, but then they just go through the same process they've gone through for the last few years, and the end result, the thing that goes in the cloud, is basically a brand new legacy application. So it's really going to take time in government for that to change. My personal opinion is that's a 3 to 5 year journey that we're going to see in agencies in terms of developing stuff internally. I think there is keenness and willingness to do it, and there's obviously a massive efficiency in it. If you actually just look at what repeatability can do in these environments, it's amazing for the agencies. But it is just a cultural thing that will take time, and it will change, and it's frustrating while we go through that journey. But it is a journey that's happening, and things will get better.
The other thing, if I think about higher education, what's worked very, very well is communities of practice, where developers do help each other and they work across those institutional boundaries. But my observation is that people don't collaborate naturally. They've got their day jobs, they've got the pressures of those day jobs. And so my observation in higher education is it's fine to have communities of practice, but what you need to do is actually put some resources behind those communities of practice to actually make it really easy for those people to get together, to share ideas, to create both the time and the mind space for them to do that. And that actually takes a bit of an investment by management, and also B, management needs to actually accept that these people need to get together and spend time and do a hackathon. And so I think there needs to be senior management support for things like hackathons and communities of practice, and resource it properly.
Absolutely. So time is fast running out in our panel. We might take this final question from the audience and then move on to closing remarks after that.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how much does government actually hand back to the community? I've had a fair bit of experience with open source within government bodies, and there's always seems to be a resistance of actually giving back to the community. In your experience, how much has government actually given back to the OpenStack's community?
So I'll make a very quick comment from a higher ed perspective, and then I'm going to hand across to perhaps my colleague here from Defence. So if I think about all the government grants that higher education get to invest in research infrastructure, and often that involves development of code and stuff like that, almost all of those grants have a condition that we have to make the IP open source and available to the nation. So from that perspective, there's a policy imperative imposed on higher education to do that. But I'll pass to my colleague about what the government actually does.
Just speaking from my experience, not as much as it probably should. We do consume, but pushing it back, you've got that problem of, can I push it back? Restrictions around what the government can provide, limitation of liability is something that gets floated around. So that process just takes away, and it's sometimes easier not to worry about that or not to push for it. But I mean, that's one thing, that if the Australian government and the APS start pushing back, the number that support OpenStack would be a lot bigger than it is now, and that would be the same for any government department in the world. It's just that if you push back, you get rid of those barriers, the numbers would be huge, and we'd have a great product that everyone would know about and use. But yeah, not as much as we possibly should.
Absolutely. Well, let us know how we can help with that. I thought it might be nice, because our panel's now out of time, to give you each an opportunity to run through and say a few quick words about this topic, just in closing. Perhaps running the opposite direction this time, starting with Joanna. So closing thoughts on open source in government.
Oh, okay. I haven't thought about that yet. Okay.
Putting you on the spot. Just say, join your local user group or something.
Yeah, open source. I always love open source. It's not just the spirit I like. It's just get everybody together and then facilitate collaborations from different, organizations. You can be developer, you can be operators, you can be totally different organization competing with each other. But open source has the magic to bring everybody together and work together, find a way to work together without killing each other. And that's how I like it. If you guys have engaged with the communities, I think you know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't, I think we have a community here, so we are always very keen to help and then all come to talk to the foundation members and try to give the information you need.
So if I reflect back almost 12 months ago, we had the big launch of the National Innovation and Science Agenda, and everything about innovation that's come out of the government. We've got a government that's talking about small to medium enterprise. One way that we could actually deliver on those things is by government agencies actually openly embracing open source, because you actually would then drive the economy around the small to medium enterprise and allow those smaller companies to get in and actually be part of the overall picture. So, that's my call to arms. Is the government's talked about innovation. It's highlighted small to medium enterprise as the engine room of the economy, but it needs to change the way the bureaucracy works such that we embrace open source that actually helps drive that agenda.
Well, I guess I actually might follow on from that point. I mean, so essentially the essence of government is to support communities, like it is to support its people. And so very much in exactly what you're saying, it's almost as an onus on government to behave in that way. And then I think if you really do go down to what's the reality of government and SME, the challenge with that is around risk. Will that company be around in 5 years? Are we investing into the right thing? And so we have to go through quite a lot of due diligence and governance and stuff when we work with government organisations. But then the answer that they don't listen to, but the obvious one is, well, if we fall apart and it's all open source, someone else can go and pick it up. And so it actually really supports that concept of small and medium businesses working together, because what we're saying isn't that you must go and lock into Vault. We're saying that you need to not lock in and consume our services, and such that if we fall apart, you can be sure before we've actually fallen apart, which isn't going to happen for the record, someone else will have stepped in, and maybe it is a big multinational like HP or SAP or Oracle, because they've obviously got a lot of stuff based around OpenStack as well. But the reality is there'll be other small businesses within Australia that can step in and fill that as well. Not all of them will go through the process of getting certified for government services, because it is a big investment and it's difficult. But it does mean that then government, whether they want to outsource that to someone else or even insource it and run it themselves, such as Defence has done, all of those options are available to them. So I can't see anything more fundamental to the success of government from an IT perspective than embracing open source. And it's in the essence of what it should be doing.
So I guess mine is just embracing change and open source. It really is giving back to the community, helping others as you would like to be helped. Just I guess the government really should have a community feel for it. So if it's open source and you're giving back, that's what government is about. It's about making sure that little council, that if you saw the HP presentation, where one little council had it, and then they started supporting all the other little councils around it, local councils, sorry. And that's what it's really about. It's just like you have an idea, you grow it, and you're helping everyone else in place that could not necessarily afford to do it or just doesn't have the skills to do it.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really fitting conclusion to our panel. So without further ado, let's please thank our panelists, Joanna Huang, Richard Northam, Rupert, Taylor Price, and Vanessa Binding. Thank you so much.